What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV, and yes, this is Too Raw for TV, and yes, you read that title correctly. Okay, I know that for many years, um, when it comes to the GOAT argument, I've sided with Jordan. Okay, but this is the thing about me: I'm always willing to look at new evidence. I'm always willing to be able to change my mind about stuff. And I would say over the past 5 years, I think I've been slowly drifting away from looking at Jordan as the undisputed GOAT, if you want to say that, to being, well, he might possibly be the GOAT, to, well, maybe, he edges out guys to the point where honestly I was kind of saying it, but I thought there were other people that had really good cases. Abdul-Jabbar and Wilt Chamberlain, right? Now to the point where just looking at all three guys, Jordan, Kareem, and Wilt, I think that Wilt Chamberlain is the greatest basketball player ever. And it's funny because when I first started watching basketball in 1990, right, and you read about these players, that was my initial conclusion. However, you can be persuaded by, I want to say propaganda. I remember I'm a Bulls fan, so that played a large part into it. But you can be swayed by the media. I put it like that. You can be swayed by their arguments. There are some things about Jordan that are very true. He was an extraordinarily dominant player. Um, he did change in a lot of ways the way organizations went about winning titles, from a big man uh, perspective to more of a perimeter player. Um, the six championships, but I think sometimes the six championships get overrated and overstated because they are, in a lot of ways, still a team accomplishment, right? Without Scottie Pippen, without these other guys, they don't win titles. Without Paul Gasol, without Shaq, Kobe doesn't win his five, vice versa. Without, Dwayne Wade or Chris Bosh or Irving or AD, LeBron wins none of those titles. So the thing about it is, to me, championships are an overrated aspect when measuring players. So that's why whenever I talk about players, you rarely hear me mention championships. That's why I don't think that Bill Russell's anywhere in the GOAT argument, because usually people who argue for Bill Russell, they always bring up championships. So why do I think Wilt's the GOAT? I mean, when you still, more than 20 years after your death, almost 50 years after you last played, and over 60 years after you made your debut, when you were born during the Great Depression, and this is 2021, and you still own, what is it, over 60, or is it still over 70 NBA records, somewhere in that vicinity? At one point, I think he owned over 90 NBA records. Let's just start with the 31,419 points. Let's just start with that from the get go. Okay, 31,419 points. Now, the first player, if I'm not mistaken, the first player I believe to score 10,000 points in a career, I believe, was George Mikan. I believe it was him. Might have been Fulks, but I think it was George Mikan. All right. By the early 1960s, the all-time leading scorers were guys like Dolph Schayes, Bob Pettit, and Paul Arizin. And they were sort of like in the teens, like 17,000, 16,000, 15,000, somewhere in that range, right? So Bob Pettit retired after the 64-65 season with 20,880 points. Okay? Now he had played 11 seasons and scored 20,880 points. The first player to crack 20,000 career points. A remarkable achievement for the time. His record lasts, if I'm not mistaken, exactly one goddamn season. 1 year later, Wilt Chamberlain, the 65-66 season, cracked 20,000 points. Now, he did this when he was only in his seventh NBA season. By comparison, it took Michael Jordan, who has the highest career scoring average, it took him 9 seasons. But you'll say, well, wait a minute, though, something's not right because Jordan has the highest career scoring average. Well, Jordan was able to stay in his role, even though as he got older and bought into the team concept, you know, he wasn't quite as ball dominant, but in some ways he was. He still was able to stay in his role as primary scorer. Wilt was, however, more willing to change and alter his game for the betterment of the team. Wilt went from being a primary scorer to slowly ceding his uber ball dominance over the years, even when he was still a primary scorer, peaking at 50.4, then going to 44.8, 36.9, 34.7, and then his last year leading the league in scoring 33.5 points per game. And then when he got traded to the Philadelphia 76ers, after playing with the Philadelphia Warriors, who then moved to San Francisco and became the San Francisco Warriors, he became more of an all-around guy. You know, he could score, but he was also a passer, playmaker type guy. And that's when he would average more around 23, 24 points a game. And that's the Wilt Chamberlain that really was putting up a lot of crazy numbers. But because blocks and steals weren't counted in his era, therefore we aren't able to see some of these things. All right. Um, and then later on, when he was with the Lakers, he kind of assumed the Bill Russell role, but in some ways he did it better. And why? Well, Bill Russell never had a season averaging more than 19 points a game. Wilt did have, I think, at least one season or two averaging 20 points a game with the Lakers, but he was no longer the first option. He was the third, and then later on fourth, and then later the last option offensively. But he could still revert back, even at that advanced age, even after a devastating leg injury, which robbed him of a lot of his athleticism and lateral quickness, robbed him of a lot of his um, vertical leap and jumping ability. But he still had a 36-inch vertical leap when he was 36 years old, 37 years old. But he still was averaging like 14, 19, and shooting something like 70% from the floor. Bill Russell, for his career, shot only 44% from the floor. So this is the thing. If Wilt Chamberlain had chose to stay a primary scorer, he probably still would have finished averaging, 34, 35 points a game, and nobody would be close to him in points per game average. Then we also have to remember this fact. Back then in NCAA rules, you couldn't leave college early. You had to uh, apply for the draft, the NBA draft, in what would have been after your fourth season. That's why Wilt, when he left Kansas early, had to play 1 year with the Harlem Globetrotters because he wanted to go play pro in '58, but he couldn't. So he played 1 year with Harlem Globetrotters, which actually helped out a lot of his skills, his ball handling and passing ability. Um, but if Wilt had been able to, under present day rules, leave college 1 year early to go play pro, then you're tacking on almost another 2,500, maybe 3,000 points, who knows, to his total already, which would have been, what, 34,000 points or something like that, right? But he finished with 31,419 points. That was the NBA record for 11 years. 11 years until Kareem Abdul-Jabbar broke it in a game in April of 1984 against the Utah Jazz with a hook shot over Mark Eaton. And I remember, subsequently, a lot of talk was about scoring and records and all that. And Wilt said something to the effect of, if I had known that there had been so much hype and hoopla about the scoring record, then I would have put it out of reach. I wouldn't have changed my game. I would have stayed the type of player, if the type of player I was, maybe for my entire career. I would have put it out of reach. Meaning that Wilt may not have retired in '73, may have played until he was 40 years old. Because remember, this is a guy that still, in scrimmages with the Magic Johnson Lakers, was shutting guys down when he was 46 years old. This is a guy that once went one on one, not in the game, but he went one on one with Mountain Man Mark Eaton, who I just mentioned, who is the official shot blocks leader, 5.6 blocks per game. I think he did it during the 85-86 season. It was either that season or 84-85. But the official shot blocks leader, Mountain Man, 7'4", 290 pounds. And Mark Eaton himself said Wilt Chamberlain moved him around like he was a rag doll. When he's in his mid-40s, this is a guy, Wilt Chamberlain, who was still getting NBA offers when he was 50 years old. You could say a gimmick or not, but they must thought there was something to him if they thought that he could be any value at that age. Michael Jordan wasn't getting NBA offers when he was 50. And it pains me to say this, but when Jordan was playing with the Wizards, sometimes he had his moments. Don't get me wrong. He had his games where he reminded you of the late '90s Jordan, but there are a lot of games where, as a Bulls fan and a former Jordan fan when he was with the Chicago Bulls, there were some games that left you kind of sad. I remember some of those games. I remember the 5 for 26 performance against the Sonics when Gary Payton shut him down. I remember him having a lot of bad games with the Wizards, especially that first year he came back. I'm not doing this to denigrate Jordan. I'm not doing this at all. I'm just trying to present a case for Wilt Chamberlain as the GOAT. Okay. Now, as far as championships are concerned, I know people are going to say, you only won 2 championships. You lost 4 finals. How could you be the GOAT when you lost that many finals? And this is all I'm going to say. This is all I'm going to say in that argument. If you're looking at championships and that's your primary, thing or whatever, then Wilt would never be your GOAT. I will say this though. Whenever someone says about Jordan, well, against Larry Bird, he was 0-6 in the playoffs. Or he has a losing record in the playoffs against Isaiah Thomas. What do they normally say? Well, look, man, he didn't have anybody playing with him. It was just him and a bunch of cokeheads. And those guys weren't really that good. And I don't dispute that. There's a lot of truth in that. And, Horace Grant and Scotty, they weren't ready. The team wasn't ready. Okay, I get that. But why won't you give Wilt Chamberlain the same slack? When he was going up against the Boston Celtics, who had Hall of Famers in every goddamn position damn near, right? When you talk about Bob Cousy, who was the Steve Nash of his day, Bill Sharman, who was the Steph Curry of his day, when you talk about Sam Jones, who was, I won't say he was Kobe as far as spectacular, spectacular, being spectacular, or as far as being, how do I want to compare him to? I'll say Reggie. I'll say he was the Reggie Miller of his day. And the only reason why I say it is because he wasn't a spectacular player. He wasn't a guy that was putting up 30 points a night. But what he was is, along with Jerry West, and some say even more so than Jerry West, the most clutch player in the NBA. Whenever they needed a big shot, he was able to provide it. You know what I'm saying? And he was a really big guard for that era, 6'4", a guard. So look, go back to what I was saying. You have the Steve Nash of that era and Bob Cousy. The Steph Curry of that era with Bill Sharman, best shooter of that era by far. Then you have the Reggie Miller of that era and Sam Jones. Tom Heinsohn, who was Rookie of the Year over Bill Russell, who was a prodigious scorer. And shit, you can almost compare him a little bit to a little bit now. I'm not saying I'm not trying to be hyperbole. I'm talking about basic elements of their game. You can kind of compare him to James Harden a little bit in that he was a volume scorer. All right. Then you got John Havlicek coming off the bench by the early 1960s, who become the all-time leading scorer for that franchise. K.C. Jones, who was a top-notch defensive player and playmaker, and Bill Russell down low. Wilt Chamberlain, he had Tom Gola, who had missed some time in the NBA due to military service, and he was getting older. Did have Guy Rogers, but he wasn't a guy that could create his own shot. Paul Arizin, who could create his own shot, but by that time, Paul Arizin was over 30, which in those days was like being over 35. And you can make the argument that Paul Arizin never quite got back to the game he had before he served in the Korean War. Served 2 years. He missed 2 NBA seasons playing in the Korean War. Plus, that team lost arguably its best player the year before. No, 2 years before Wilt got there, when he had a career-ending injury, Johnston. So what I'm saying is Wilt didn't have the same pieces. Later on, Nate Thurman was drafted, but Nate was more of a backup. He wasn't getting a lot of minutes. So Wilt did not have that same team anywhere near the same firepower. However, Usually, when they did play Boston, those games went down to the wire. The difference in those games wasn't the matchup between Wilt and Russell. So that's the difference. See, it's not like it was Olajuwon versus Robinson and, Bill Russell was kicking Wilt's ass. That's bullshit. The difference in those series was the guard play. And usually in those series, Sam Jones and Bob Cousy would get off, and Bill Sharman. Why? Well, Sam Jones, being 6'4", 198, those guys couldn't handle him. Their guards couldn't handle, the quickness and athleticism. I'm not saying he was overly explosive, but those guys, those 30-something-year-old guards couldn't handle those dudes, man. That's what decided the series. Sam Jones and Bob Cousy and early on Bill Sharman. Now, Bob Cousy was a little older, but Bob Cousy was one of those guys that played better longer. Okay? If I'm not mistaken, Wilt Chamberlain, whatever team he was on, went against Boston in 4 Game 7s. And the margin of points combined in those games was 9 points in Boston's favor. So they averaged only 2 points more than whatever team Wilt played on. 1-on-1, Wilt Chamberlain dominated Bill Russell. But to be more precise, it was never really Bill Russell versus Wilt. It was Wilt Chamberlain versus the Boston Celtics because he was often routinely doubled and triple teamed. But despite all of this, in his career against Bill Russell, Wilt Chamberlain still shot 50% from the floor. He averaged 30 points and 30 rebounds against supposedly the best defensive player of all time. Whereas Bill Russell, when he played against Wilt Chamberlain, averaged 14 points, 23 rebounds, but only shot 37% from the floor. Whenever Wilt Chamberlain had a healthy, comparable team around him, when they were healthy, those were the teams that you saw excel. The 67 76ers beat the shit out of Boston in the playoffs and won the championship. The 72 Lakers. All right, even though they weren't exactly spring chickens, they had a 33-game win streak, won 69 games, which was a record at the time, breaking the record of his other team, the 67 76ers. You know what I'm saying? They won the title. By 1973, they tried to repeat, but that team was getting old. And the Knicks, by the way, people try to frame this narrative that the Knicks took down a Goliath, but last I saw, didn't that lineup have 5 Hall of Famers? As I've said time and time again, Walt Clyde Frazier, Hall of Famer, Earl the Pearl Monroe, Hall of Famer, Bill Bradley, Hall of Famer, Dave DeBusschere, Hall of Famer, Willis Reed, Hall of Famer, Jerry Lucas, Hall of Famer. Come on, man. But like I said, they were fresher. Jerry West was close to being done. Wilt Chamberlain was not the same force he was. Gail Goodrich was getting older. That team was, getting kind of beat up. Abdul-Jabbar had retired the year before. So that's what I got to say about the championships, man. Did Wilt win enough? No. I know he wanted to win more than 2 championships. But as I said before, what other great player that wasn't playing with Bill Russell won more than Wilt? Oscar wasn't winning shit. Oscar didn't win a goddamn thing, okay, until he teamed up with a prime Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. It took a 50-point game by Bob Pettit and a sprained Bill Russell ankle, if I'm not mistaken, for the then St. Louis Hawks to eke out a victory in 1958 against Boston. So basically what I'm saying is Boston dominated everybody, not just Wilt Chamberlain. They dominated every fucking body. Now back to the individual. Rebounding, Wilt Chamberlain's numbers are absurd. Okay, you can argue pace, and there's a lot of truth in that. You know, the pace kind of, you know, inflated their numbers to an extent. But I also say the same thing about this era and the three-point shot. This era, the pace inflates players' numbers compared to 20 years ago. Plus a three-point shot. If you got guys shooting 11 three-pointers and, you know, the pace is so much faster and teams are averaging 112, 113, 115 points a game compared to 20 years ago when you had teams averaging only 88, 83 points a game, 84 points a game, you know, and they weren't shooting the three ball like that. Of course, that's why Allen Iverson was able to lead the NBA scoring in '99 with only 26 points a game. Because it was a totally different league, a totally different era, where uh, 14 of the top 20 scorers were post players. It was a totally different era. But that's why you got to account for error when you look at numbers. But I do know this too. The 1980s was also a fast-paced era. Not quite as fast-paced as the 60s, but it was a fast-paced era comparable to today, and in some ways, you know, a little bit faster with some teams. Remember, the Denver Nuggets in the early 80s set a record with 126.5 points per game. So in some ways, it was even faster than today, right? So why wasn't anybody averaging 20 rebounds a game then? The closest you got was Moses, a couple seasons averaging 17 or 18. Then, of course, Dennis Rodman, he had a season averaging 18 or 19. But what were the 24, 25, 27 rebound per game seasons? You had some seasons where the pace was comparable, but nobody was coming close to doing it. Wilt Chamberlain, well, before I even say him, Bill Russell averaged 22.5 rebounds per game, 21,620 total. Wilt Chamberlain had so many other duties other than defensive rebound, but he still managed to average 22.9 rebounds per game. 22.9 rebounds per game. 23,924 rebounds. No one's going to come close to that, by the way. No one's going to come close to Wilt's 55 rebounds in a game. Nobody. Nobody's going to come close to that. People oohed and awed when Kevin Love had a 30-30 performance. 31 points, something like that, and 31 rebounds. Well, you know, Wilt had 60-40 games. Wilt had 70-40 games. 100 points and 25 rebounds. Even his passing is impressive for a big man. Wilt led the league in assists, excuse me. He led the league in assists as a center. As a matter of fact, when you take Jordan and Wilt's and you look at their combined top 5 assist seasons, Wilt has 2 of them. Jordan averaged 5.3 assists for his career. Wilt averaged 4.4. But one thing you got to remember, though, is when Wilt played, the assist was a lot harder to come by. because the NBA was a lot more stringent in how what they ruled an assist was. The pass had to lead directly to a bucket, alley oop, or you know, you had to pass to a guy while he's in the motion of, laying it up or whatever, catches it and lays it up. The guy had to catch it and shoot. It couldn't be no how it is now where the guy can dribble. You know how a guy can get a pass, can dribble, then get to a position where he's come. You can't do any of that. You can't put the ball. You couldn't do any of that back then, or it wouldn't be considered an assist. So you wonder how many assists Wilt would have had if they were as lazy and as lenient as they are today with assists. Now steals, I'm not going to even argue that one. That's Jordan. Steals are usually a guard-dominated statistic, although there have been some big men who had their fair share of steals. Dave Robinson's one. The most prolific that I can think of is Akeem Olajuwon, who I think is the only center to surpass 2,000 steals. But you do wonder, with the athleticism that Wilt Chamberlain had, his speed, you do wonder how many steals he may have accumulated. I don't know. I'm not even going to speculate on that. But I will speculate on this one. Blocks. This is the statistic that I think has robbed Wilt Chamberlain of his all-time great status. And I find it interesting that the NBA didn't start monitoring blocks until the year after Wilt Chamberlain retired. Why? Why exactly the year after he retired? Well, how many blocks did Wilt have? Well, we'll never know for the exact number, but I'll put it to you like this. I believe there was a game against the Detroit Pistons where Wilt had 28 blocks in the game. And I'm certain that Wilt has more career 20 block games than anybody in history, even Bill Russell. And I believe his name is Harvey Pollack. I believe he was the longtime statistician for the Philadelphia 76ers. He went through a year span, okay, 112 game span of counting Wilt's statistics, his numbers. And he documented that during that 112 game span, Wilt averaged 8.8 blocks per game. 8.8. Now, this is Wilt when he was 31 and probably weighed about, at that time, probably 295. Not exactly the biggest he was. The biggest he was with the Lakers. It was 310, 315, the headband era Wilt. But he probably had lost a little of his vertical leap from his Warriors days when he was 260, 270, 275, the 50-point per game Wilt, 45 points per game Wilt. So it stands to reason that a guy who some people say had a 50-inch vertical leap in his prime, that's not really that far out of the realm of possibility. When you also combine the fact that it was a very fast pace, this guy was playing almost every minute of every game, some seasons, usually at least 45 minutes a game. So he played almost the entire goddamn game. With this incredible athletic ability, he could touch the top of the backboard. Very few human beings could do that. So in reality, Wilt Chamberlain is the all-time leader in blocks. We just are not able to say how many. But if you were to put a guess on it, I would say, what would his career average in blocks be? 7? probably averaged fewer blocks as a Laker, maybe 4 to 5. More so with the Warriors, maybe 9 plus, maybe approaching 10 a game. What's the difference? About 7? That sounds about right. So this is a guy that could have had over 7,000 blocks. Over 7,000 blocks in his career. 7,000 blocks in his career, right? Then there's the other statistic that people don't want to bring up, and that's triple doubles. Now, Michael Jordan had 27 triple doubles in his career. Now, to be fair, Michael never really pushed triple doubles like that. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Wilt Chamberlain probably had at least 400 triple doubles, maybe more. He's probably the only player in NBA history to actually have a quintuple double. Fuck quadruple, quintuple. He had a game where he had 20 points, 20 rebounds, 20 assists, 10 steals, 10 blocks. No other player, no other human being has ever done that before. Then another thing is this. When you're going to be a great scorer, you're going to shoot the ball, one of the things that used to always be professed was efficiency. Remember, Larry Bird once said, if you were shooting 45% or lower, you went to the bench. Now, in today's NBA with the three-point shot, a lot of guys aren't shooting that percentage. Um, and, it doesn't really matter. And there are some exceptions. Allen Iverson played in a very, you know, played in an era where field goal percentages were lower because of defense, spacing, things of that nature. So you give him some leeway in that area. But Jordan was known for being a very efficient player. No one will ever take that away from his efficiency as a shooting guard, especially considering how much he shot the ball, was incredible. He shot 49.7% from the floor. He had I believe it was a 5-year stretch, 87 to 92, where he shot over 50% each year. Even in 93 and 96, he shot just a little bit under 50%. So his efficiency as a guard is not questioned. But this is the thing, though. Even Michael Jordan's most efficient season, which is 89-90, when he shot 53.9% from the floor, still is a little bit lower than Wilt Chamberlain's overall field goal percentage career of 54%. Now, Wilt would be higher than that if it wasn't for the fact that in his earliest Warriors days, Wilt was not just confined to being in the post. Wilt was a guy that also had a jumper, and he was featured. This is a guy that had a fall-away jumper. This is a guy that had a hook shot and a bank shot. And you probably have seen it in old highlights of Wilt out on the perimeter. He wasn't a guy that was just confined to shooting under the basket. Now, over time, Wilt was a guy that Wilt became a player that had the basketball IQ to realize that you got to get the most out of your attempts. So as he became, as he shot the ball less, he became more efficient, and he stayed more and more in the paint or in the post. And that's when Wilt transitioned from being a guy, say, shooting 46, 47%, 48% first couple of years. A lot of that was also because he was being double and triple teamed a lot. Being the first player in NBA history to shoot 50% from the floor, to being a guy shooting in the mid-50s. By the time he was, in his last years with the Warriors, to being a guy shooting in the upper 50s, 58, 59% with the 76ers, to being a guy shooting in the 60 percentile and 70s with the Lakers, leading the NBA field goal percentage 9 times in his what was it, 14-year career, he led the NBA in field goal percentage, I think, 9 times. Michael Jordan never led the league in field goal percentage. I expect you shouldn't see that from a guard, but let's remember that Paul Arizin, who was a small forward, led the NBA in field goal percentage one year. So it's not impossible. John Stockton had a season shooting 56% from the floor. And John Stockton, I believe, has a higher career field goal percentage than Michael Jordan. He shot over 50% for his career. So I'm just saying, you know, um, I think when you just look at what each player was able to do um, from an individual standpoint, as dominant as Jordan was, and you can argue that the NBA did put in some things to try to influence scoring because of Jordan not being in the game in the 90s. You know what I'm saying? But they specifically altered the game to try to minimize Wilt Chamberlain's dominance because he was that goddamn scary. The lanes were widened to try to lessen Chamberlain's dominance. When he was in college, Wilt, they changed 2 rules. Earlier in college, Wilt was able the team was able to just inbound the ball. They were able to just throw lobs over the backboard for Wilt to catch and dunk it in. The NCAA got rid of that. Also, as we all know, Wilt Chamberlain was not a great foul shooter, and that is, I understand this is Achilles' heel, and people are going to bring that up. In college, to get around this, what Wilt would do is he would get the basketball and he would literally jump from behind the free throw line and dunk the ball in. Remember, the rule said that your feet can't touch the floor. Technically, Wilt's feet were not touching the floor, so he wasn't breaking any rules. And number one, they didn't think that that was humanly possible to do, and since it was impossible to do for anybody else other than him, they got rid of it. You couldn't do that. But that's how scary and how dominant Wilt Chamberlain was as a basketball player. Michael Jordan had 39 career 50-point games. Unbelievable total. By comparison, Wilt Chamberlain had 45 100-point games in one season alone, the 61-62 season. 45 times in one season. 45 games of an 80-game schedule time. 45 of the 80 games, Wilt Chamberlain broke the 50-point barrier. 122 games of his career, Wilt Chamberlain had at least 50 points in a game. Jordan, 27 career triple doubles. Wilt Chamberlain probably somewhere around 400. That's an estimate, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, but around 400 triple doubles in his career. If you were to ask most players of Wilt Chamberlain's generation, despite Bill Russell's 11 titles, if you were to ask most of those players who was the greatest player of that era, 90% of them said Wilt Chamberlain. Most of the sports writers who watched both Wilt and Jordan play say that Wilt Chamberlain was the greatest player they ever saw. this didn't really change, to be honest with you. This argument didn't really begin to change until after Wilt Chamberlain died. I'm being honest with you. Then I started noticing this new narrative. And this new narrative was, well, Wilt Chamberlain played a bunch of short white guys. Wilt Chamberlain beat up a bunch of 6'4" midgets. I kept hearing this. And you know what? It may have had an effect on my thinking. Even though I know that it's bullshit, I did start thinking, well, maybe those guys were a little shorter. Bill Russell was only 6'9". But then I thought, I said, well, yeah, it might be some truth to that. Bullshit. It's absolute bullshit propaganda. First of all, the average height right now is 6'6". Okay? 6'6". When Wilt Chamberlain was averaging 50 points a game in the 61-62 campaign, the average height was 6'6". So it's absolute bullshit that players are bigger than they were back then. Now, were they bigger than they were in the 50s? A little bit, but not by as much as you would think. Even when the NBA first started in the 40s, the average height was 6'2". Even in the late 50s, the average height was 6'4", 6'5". So what I'm saying is this idea that these guys were like the aliens and fucking players back then were like the aliens in Space Jam is bullshit. Players were a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, but not by as much as you would think. And like I said before, and this is something I really got to bring up, and this is, people not going to like this, but let's look at competition by position. Now, I'm not saying Jordan didn't have, uh, he didn't have, competition in the 80s, because I do. But let's be honest about something. How much Hall of Fame competition did Jordan have in the 90s? Let's be honest here. Mitch Richmond, Reggie Miller, Clyde Drexler. That's good. That's really good. As far as guards, that's pretty much. Trying to think now before I go forward. Let me see. Mitch Richmond, Reggie Miller, Clyde Drexler, and anybody else? Joe Dumars. Okay, Joe Dumars. So that's 4. Now, I'm not counting point guards or, I'm not counting those or small forwards. I'm counting shooting guards. Now, I'm not going to include Kobe because Kobe kind of came later. So I'm including guys that he specifically went against that were Hall of Famers. I think that's it. I might be missing somebody, but I think that's it from the top of my head. Now, Wilt Chamberlain. Let's see. In his career, he went up against guys that were in the Hall of Fame. Let's see. Of course, Bill Russell. Got Nick Thurman. Got Walt Bellamy. Got Willis Reed. Got Zelmo Beatty. Got Bob Lanier. So already that's 6. Let's see, who else? You got Elvin Hayes, the Big E. You got Wes Unseld. So that's 8 right there. Now remember, we're talking about an NBA that at the most, by his last year, had 17 teams versus a league that had 29 teams by the end of the 90s. So that's 8. Who else? Who else? I'm not going to count power forwards. Okay. Um, who else do we have? Competition at the center position. Oh, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. How did I forget that one? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, that's 9. Um, that's 9. 9 Hall of Famers in a league, 9 Hall of Fame centers in a league that only had, let's just say, 14 to 17 teams by the end, right? 14 to 17 teams, 9 Hall of Fame centers, versus a league with 29 teams and or 27 teams earlier on in the 90s with 4 Hall of Fame shooting guards. And I feel like I'm forgetting some players. I probably am. But, I could go on and on. I could talk about the fact that Wilt was an even greater athlete than Jordan, higher vertical leap, Olympic style athlete. He was an Olympian level shot putter, a guy that could bench press, 570, 580 pounds. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's an Olympic champion, all world bodybuilder, was in awe of what Wilt Chamberlain could do in the gym. Um, I mean, what else? I mean, what else? What can I say, man? Honestly, I, I I know some people are gonna like this video. Some people are going to curse me, unsubscribe, but that's just how I feel. I think that Wilt Chamberlain is greater than Michael Jordan. I still think Jordan's great though, but I think Wilt's better.